Welcome back. Every Friday, it seems, we begin this segment by saying in some shape or form, what a week. We're running out of adjectives, and just as we're becoming increasingly numb over the rhetoric and the angry vitriol Republicans and Democrats are tossing at each other daily, we are shocked yet again. This week, it was a near massacre on a baseball field just outside of Washington, where congressional Republicans were practicing for their charity baseball game against congressional Democrats. Baseball, charity. Two things Americans love and cherish. House Majority Whip Steve Scalise remains in critical conditions. Democrats and Republicans are finally talking about toning down the language. Good. Because as CBS's Scott Pelley wrote this week, violence always begins with words. Joining us with analysis of the week is Cheryl Wilson, Chair of the Manatee County Democratic Party, and Jack Brill, Vice Chair of the Republican Party of Sarasota, and Zach Murdoch, local government reporter for the Herald Tribune. And thanks for joining us, but let me both put you all on the spot. You know, every week we go over viewer comments about the show that we did the night before, and every time we do these political shows, I go over the comments, and a lot of the comments are ugly. And they're written by both Democrats and Republicans, and I'm not going to say who does it more, but they're really ugly. And the perception now is it's getting dangerous. So, as the Vice Chair of the Republican Party and the Chair of the Democratic Party, what do you say to your own party members and followers about how they're talking about the other side, Jack?
Well, I try and make sure we stay with facts. You know, after what has happened this week, and the thing is that this level of uncivility is not happening just on a federal level. It's happening on a state level and local level. And I mean, you know, you try and have good candidates and to become, you know, run for office, and good people that will take care of your communities. And, you know, if they're being threatened every other week, you're not going to have anybody, you know, that's going to run. And that's bad. That's not good for our county, our cities, our local areas. So, you know, yes, you want to win, you want to do the right thing for the community, but there's got to be a point where, you know, guys, tone it down a little bit, you know. And this week just summed up of everything that went wrong and what is wrong with what has been going on, both nationally and, you know, and regional and locally, you know, with the shootings. I mean, that could have been so much worse.
Cheryl, you know, in the case of this week, it was a disturbed man who was a Bernie Sanders supporter. In other cases, it's been somebody who supported the other side. But again, you have people who are so angry about what's happening in our country, and that's legitimate, but the way they express it on both sides, what do you tell Democrats about how they go after their political gains or aims right now?
I would agree pretty much with what Jack just said. I think the word and the message that we send to our volunteers, the people that work with us closely, is let's talk about what we can do. Let's talk about what we can do to make a difference. Let's talk about what our solutions are, what our suggestions are, and let's leave the rhetoric and the hate-filled speech off to the sidelines. We have an obligation as a leader, as a leadership role, and that goes up the chain. We have an obligation, or we expect that we have an obligation from our office holders. We have an obligation from the media. We have an obligation from many, many levels in this whole picture, this whole game we play. And it's up to all of us to tone that down and get back to functioning and looking at the issues and the solutions and having a dialogue.
You know, Zach, we have seen this at least begin to play out on the streets of Sarasota. I remember the protests a while back involving immigration, and you had both sides that were protesting peacefully, but there were people who were trying to, you know, rev it up a little bit. So, you know, how often do you see this, and whether you're covering City Hall or covering protests like that for sanctuary cities?
Well, I think we've been really fortunate locally because I mean, we have a pretty sophisticated community here that's very well informed, and things certainly do get heated, as they probably should in a lot of ways, because these are serious issues. But locally, it just has never risen to the level that we see, you know, up in Washington, D.C. and playing out online. In person, we've had some heated debates, whether it's at the dais in City Hall or in the county chambers, or the public comments that folks give when they're upset about certain issues, but it's never escalated the way we've started to see in other places.
I guess what concerns me is I saw the former CIA director on TV recently who traveled in Europe and was thinking about what happened in the Balkans in the 1990s, and his point was the fabric of society is so thin that when you see something like that, you are reminded that words becoming violence is not something that is out of our ability to imagine. It happens. And I guess what the concerns are that we're seeing on both sides of the aisle.
And you mentioned in your comment, Alan, you used the word disturbed. This was a disturbed individual. What we don't know yet is what we're finding out, unfortunately, is how our words and our rhetoric and our ramping up all the time affect those disturbed individuals and how it creates disturbed individuals. We don't know what we're creating yet. And I think that's what it behooves, again, those of us who are willing to sit down and have that discussion to think about.
Including office holders who sometimes put out some pretty provocative tweets themselves, but we'll get into that maybe a little bit later. We are just getting started, and we'll pick up with our analysis of the week in Washington right now after we check on our weather. Stay with us. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we are discussing the week in Washington, from the shooting at a congressional baseball game practice to President Trump's change in course on U.S.-Cuba relations. Our guests tonight are Cheryl Wilson of the Manatee County Democratic Party and Jack Brill of the Republican Party of Sarasota and Zach Murdoch of the Herald Tribune. So President Trump today wakes up early, as he often does, and starts tweeting, which is always interesting. And today he seemingly confirmed that he is now under a criminal investigation into allegations of obstruction of justice in terms of the firing of FBI Director James Comey. And Jack, I heard somebody say this morning what I do sometimes hear, even from Republicans. I wish somebody would walk into his office, get his phone, and take a hammer to it. Because if you're talking about what a lawyer would tell you to do, talking about that you're under a criminal investigation and so forth is really kind of stepping on your lawyer's mission in terms of keeping you out of trouble.
Well, all the tweeting and all the rumors and all the reports that are happening until Robert Mueller comes out with his final report, that's when the seriousness or lack of, or the seriousness and the lack of or seriousness of it'll either be there's something there or there's not.
But here's the
But all the rest of this is just,
But here's the
space.
problem. The White House is desperately trying to get back onto message and push along health care or tax reform or infrastructure, and their ability to do that is continually stepped on by the president himself when he does these tweets. So what do you do?
Not much. Read them like everybody else.
You don't think that it's going to stop when something happens. When Robert Mueller issues his statement, the tweets aren't going to stop. I think, if anything, we have learned that we thought he was going to be a different candidate once he had the nomination, or we thought he was going to behave differently once he became president, or he was going to behave differently once he was inaugurated. And we have learned that that isn't going to happen. So this is what this president is. And it's right back to the rhetoric. Now, we're not talking anymore about the violent rhetoric, but we're talking about legal rhetoric, and we're talking about legislative rhetoric, and it's getting in the way.
Cheryl, let me ask you this, because the president said in a tweet, when it comes to getting a health care bill moving forward, we have no help. It's only obstruction from the Democrats. The Democrats are destroying health care in this country. To what you say?
To what I say? I say we would like to see what that health care bill entails so that we can participate in it, so that we can help with it. They're sitting in Senate offices off the floor in private and crafting that bill, not putting it out there for the Democrats to contribute, for the committee people to have some input into it. So what do I say? I would say let's get it out there. Let's have the conversation. Let's lower the rhetoric of the conversation. Let's accomplish something.
Zach, let me ask you this, because there are a whole lot of people who live on the Sun Coast who voted for the president because they believe that not only will he bring back American jobs, but that middle income salaries will rise, and some of the things that have dogged us over the last 8 years we'll see some movement on. Do you get any sense out there that people are becoming frustrated, and frustrated with whom in particular?
Well, I think a lot of what I hear echoes what Jack said, that people get frustrated that it seems to be the conversation is only ever about what the president tweets or the latest turn of the screw in the investigations that are ongoing and plastered all over TV every minute of the day now. And I don't get the sense that it's always necessarily frustration with the president himself as much as it is with the way folks like you and I are presenting that information to them. Though I would make the argument to Jack that all of the spokespeople around the president have made clear that he speaks for himself, and at any moment you'd have to hear it from him, and that's turned the attention to the messages that he sends out, which in most cases are on Twitter.
There is some polling that's starting to come out, Jack, that shows that that the president is starting to lose support among his base, which remains very strong for him, but they are getting a little bit frustrated with how these things were being handled and the lack of progress in terms of an agenda.
Well, I'm hoping that a lot of the items that are part of the agenda are being worked on, and we don't hear about it until it's ready to be presented properly to the Congress, and to the people. So those are things I'm okay with not hearing what's going on with healthcare every 6 hours or every 2 hours. Let's get a good plan together. Let's on multiple fronts, and then let's present it out. And once it's done, once it's ready to go.
Was it helpful when the president himself called the version that was passed by the House mean?
The president is entitled to his opinion, like we all are. So that's his opinion.
Cheryl?
I think it's the mood of the moment. When it's the Democrats' fault, it's the Democrats' fault. When it's the Republicans' fault and the plan is mean, it's someone else's fault. It's the mood of the moment.
But as we talked about earlier, this rhetoric is coming from all sides.
It absolutely is.
And it's coming from elected officials. It's coming from everywhere. So you unfortunately, both parties, there are a lot of folks that are at fault. And I will go back to your original question. Let's get a year under our belt of the administration. Let's get, there's still 300 and some odd key posts that haven't been filled yet. Now, whatever the reasons may be, but let's get some action, let's get some activity and action going.
Let's get one more issue in here. Today, the president was in Miami, rolling back some of President Obama's softening of the relationship between the U.S. and Cuba, and that's getting mixed reviews. From what I understand, Zach, older Cuban Americans down in Miami, that's what they wanted to hear, but the Cuban Americans don't speak with one voice anymore, and younger Cuban Americans think quite differently.
Yeah, that's true, and after hearing all of the news come out of that announcement today, it sounds like there are still a whole slew of unanswered questions about how the government ultimately crafts those rules over the next several months that's going to determine how young Cuban Americans and older Cuban Americans really fall on that spectrum of how the rules are actually loosened and what that ultimately means for the way they can interact.
And Jack, let me ask you this, because the president today talked a lot about human rights in Cuba and how they're being violated, and more than one person remarked this afternoon, boy, we didn't hear about that when he was in Saudi Arabia.
Well, Cuba's 90 miles from our coast. It should be equal for all countries. We are, a nation that is always based on human rights, freedom, and building democracies around the world, and it should be equal for across the board. But, to the point of, where you look at even with Cuba, and some of the things, we find out today that Raul Castro's son-in-law, his government agency owns all the major hotels in downtown Havana, so it's going back to the government. It's not going to private enterprise.
Now, Jack, whose family owns hotels? Who in this country, whose family owns hotels?
That's private. It's not the government collecting money.
Sure, I'll give you the last word.
Well, I believe very much Donald Trump today was standing in Little Havana. That is a large vote block. And there's nothing that Donald Trump enjoys more than reliving his 2016 presidential election. And there's nothing I think that he looks more forward to than a 2020 re-election campaign. So there weren't a lot of Saudi Arabian immigrants in an audience where he spoke.
Let's take a quick break, and when we return, we'll have final thoughts from our guests, plus what some of our viewers are saying about last night's topic, what's being done to keep millennials on the Suncoast. Welcome back. Will the attack on a member of Congress bring about unity going forward? Could it at least reduce the vitriol and partisan rhetoric? And what does President Trump's shift towards Cuba mean for us in Florida? Our guests join us right now for final thoughts. And Zach, I'll begin with you. What do you think the mood is on the Suncoast with everything that's happening up in Washington?
Well, I think it is tense down here. Fortunately, it's not quite ratcheted up to the level that it is in Washington, D.C., but I think people watch it carefully and have trouble deciding what to make of it. And hopefully we don't see that kind of thing start to boil over down here, and I wouldn't think it would. But people are obviously watching it very closely, and it will inform the conversations we have down here.
Jack and Cheryl, I'm curious what both of you think in terms of, we're going to have a midterm election coming up, and then 2 years later another general election. Are you starting to think about, or are you concerned about the impact all this is going to have for the next election cycle?
Well, the 2018 election cycle's already started. We're already planning, we're organizing. We know it, we approach every election cycle the same way with the same efforts to do, to get our candidates reelected and elected. So I don't think there's anything any different. There'll be a lot of information that flows, and a lot of the stuff as the process goes on, but we're not doing, we're going to be out there very aggressive and aggressively to get our candidates reelected.
Are you concerned that you may have an energized opposition and a slightly depressed home team?
Well, I guess I don't think we'll have, no, we will not have a depressed home team, and we can't have any more opponents than we did in the 2016. Think about it. Remember, we had everything from hospital board all the way up. So this isn't any different than any other year.
Well, I'll tell you, you have an energized opponent. There is no doubt that we have energized Democrats. We sent 15 people this morning to Roswell, Georgia to work for John Ossoff in that 6th district of Georgia. We have more interest in local races, in state races, and what in the world are we going to do in 2020 from local Democrats in Manatee County than we have seen all through the cycle.
But are you expanding beyond just your registered Democrats? Are you seeing any increased support amongst independents? Because if you don't get that, then it's going to be very hard to win anything.
I point out to our team all the time that our job is the political side of this. These issues grab everybody, and we certainly want to elect people that are with us on the issues. But our job as the party is the political work there. And yes, what we're seeing, who we're seeing coming into our office are the dissatisfied, just completely discouraged independents. We're even having some Republicans call us and say, I just can't do this anymore. I can't stick with them anymore.
It's the same thing we had in 2010 and 14 on the other side, and we love a good challenge, so we're going to go out and win in 2018.
And how to work
Game
for
on,
you.
folks. Yeah. All right. Before we go, we want to share with you what some of our viewers are saying about last night's topic, retaining young talent on the Suncoast. Graduations are taking place at colleges and universities across the area. This month, there's a perception most of these grads will leave the Suncoast. However, people from the Chamber of Commerce, Young Professionals Group, and Hub are working to foster entrepreneurship in ways to make the area more friendly to millennials. Here is what some of you are saying. Robert Kirsting writes, there is nothing to keep the younger crowd here. I work full-time. I can't even afford to live. One check goes to rent, then broke for 2 weeks, then my next check goes to bills, then broke again. Mary Valley writes, Tampa is where it's at for the job market right now, especially for college grads. And Valerie Bono writes, low wages, high costs, and no to nightlife and no community for young folks. Why would they stay? Well, what do you think about the shooting attack on a member of Congress? And what about the change in course for our nation's policy towards Cuba? Join the conversation by visiting our Facebook page at facebook.com/news@7. And FYI, you can watch past Roundtable discussions on demand. They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. Thanks to our guests for being here tonight. Cheryl Wilson is the chair of the Manatee County Democratic Party. Jack Brill is vice chair of the Republican Party of Sarasota. And Zach Murdoch covers local government for the Herald Tribune.